Our first presentation today. First of all, welcome to the 2022 Oxford Symposium in School-Based Family Counseling webinar. We're holding a webinar because of the continuing problems with the pandemic, but next year we all plan to be back in Oxford at Breunlin College or one of the colleges there. Our first presentation is titled Internal Family Systems Therapy, School-Based Family Counseling Applications. And our presenter is Dr. Ralph Cohen. Ralph is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Counselor Education and Family Therapy at Central Connecticut State University. He served as director of the master's program in marriage and family therapy for nearly 30 years. Dr. Cohen developed innovations in teaching the family systems paradigm, applying an integrative meta-frameworks approach in conceptualizing various domains of systems theory. He also developed a specialty track in the master's program in school-based family counseling and has been a leading proponent of the internal family systems, IFS, therapy model developed by RichardSchwartz, PhD. Dr. Cohen has also been instrumental in the realm of school-based family counseling through his leadership in the Connecticut Association for Marriage and Family Therapy Advocacy Committee. He and his colleague, Dr. Kathleen Landy, were instrumental in the passage of legislation in Connecticut to create a state certification for MFTs to work in school systems. In 2017, he was awarded the Outstanding Contribution to School-Based Family Counseling by the Oxford Symposium in School-Based Family Counseling. Dr. Cohen retired from his university teaching position in June 2022. He continues his clinical practice in West Hartford, Connecticut, and continues to work with the Office of Continuing Education at Central Connecticut State University in teaching IFS to professionals and graduate students. So please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. It's very humbling to hear that, and it's very great to see a lot of familiar and very missed faces, and I'm glad at least we can do this. Unfortunately, I have to jump off after my presentation. I'll stay for a little bit for yours, Kathy, but I have a doctor's appointment that I have to get to. So I have a lot to cover in a short period of time. So,
everybody, please make sure to mute your screen.
thank you.
And Ralph, could you please share your screen as well?
Yes. So I'm just going to get right to it. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, sounds like someone is still on. Okay. So I'm going to share with you kind of the interface of my 30 years of work at the university, combining IFS with my clinical practice and also my school-based work. Many of you are not familiar with the internal family systems model, so I'm going to give you the busman's tour of it really quickly. I hope it registers enough so that I can share a case study with you and that you can follow it according to the model that I'm going to very briefly present. So just, many of you know me, but some of you don't, so I'm just going to do a very quick overview. Brian covered a lot of it. I'm a licensed psychologist and family therapist. Actually, looking over this, I think Brian pretty much covered all that, so I'm going to just save some time and skip So the purpose of the presentation is, first of all, to demonstrate that the IFS model provides a roadmap for understanding how we respond to trauma and how we can foster resilience in the wake of traumatizing events. Secondly, I'd like to introduce the basic concepts behind the IFS model, and I'll focus on specific ways that the model can provide school-based family counselors with tools to build their own resilience. What I call putting your mask on yourself first so that you'll be able to help others. And then thirdly, to provide a case example using the IFS model to assist a teacher displaying symptoms of trauma, and will be offered to demonstrate an application of the model in school settings. And I just want to say, on my drive up to my office, I was hearing the news report about Alex Jones, who claimed that Newtown shootings didn't happen. And the case study is about a teacher that was deeply affected by it. So it's funny how things juxtapose like that. So what is IFS? So just to give you an overview, it was developed as a psychotherapy. Oops, sorry about that. I was very sensitive now. Started as a psychotherapy model. It was developed in the early 1980s by RichardSchwartz. He was from Chicago, and he also was a key author in the meta frameworks model that we use to teach family therapy at Central. The model is a multiplicity model. So we talk about our core self and parts. Parts are subpersonalities that interact as people do on the outside. They're autonomous minds that are also interconnected. So it's a very relational model. The self is a core concept. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there are certain leadership qualities that our core self possesses, and we all have one. In the absence of the leadership of the self, there's a breakdown in the interrelationships among our different parts, or internal family members, you might call them. And they break down into groups of extreme roles, what we call managers, and firefighters, which protect the system in different ways, and also the exiles, who are parts of us that are deeply affected by trauma and devaluing experiences, and hold all the feelings, beliefs, sensations of trauma that activate other parts to protect the system and to protect these parts from getting hurt again. But in the absence of the self, a person has the experience of being fragmented. And it's like in the movie or the book, Lord of the Flies, the children take over and they form coalitions and they start attacking to each other. But they do so in the service of trying to help and protect. It just doesn't go right. So the goals of this model are to increase self-leadership in the system, to free parts from extreme roles and polarizations, and to restore balance and harmony among the parts. So that's a very brief overview. So this is just kind of a pictorial way of looking at our internal system. If you think of the self as the big yellow ball in the center, kind of like the sun, the solar system, and our parts connect around the self and also connect to each other. This is a tool that I use in therapy sometimes, where people can identify parts and how they relate to the self and one another. And This was an actual client from about 2 days ago that that put this together. So I want to talk a little bit about the notion of self-leadership because it's the key to the model. So the self is a level of entity that's different from the parts. You might think of it as your seat of consciousness. Unlike parts, it's invisible because it's the you who is observing. It's what you see from your own eyes when it's not filtered through the belief systems and feelings of our internal parts. The self is also relational. It serves as the leader of the person's systems of subpersonalities or parts. The self contains qualities of good leadership, what we call the 8 C's. And this is how we know that we are connected to what we call self-energy when we experience qualities of calm, curiosity, compassion, confidence, courage, clarity, connectedness, and creativity. Those are all functions of self-leadership. And so when the self leads the system, in other words, when we have our self embodied, these qualities are available as resources for our inner and external systems to function well on a day-to-day basis, and also to heal trauma. We also have an experience of feeling whole and connected to ourselves and connected to other people. So that's a healthy system where there's leadership from the self and balance and harmony among our parts. So everyone has such a self, but it can be obscured by the extreme of parts when the system is overwhelmed by trauma or devaluing experiences. You know, think about students that are bullied, for example. You know, they're demeaned by other kids or even by teachers when they're singled out, or abuse that happens in the home. Our protective parts take over, and it's almost as if our self is pushed out of our body, kind of like that sense of near-death experience that people talk about when they have a car accident where they see themselves on, from a distance. So with a lack of self-leadership, members of the system, what we're going to call our parts, become vulnerable. They take on protective roles, which are extreme, and they absorb the energy of trauma. That includes all the neurological connections to the experience in terms of feelings, beliefs, sensations, and so forth. So 2 classes of protectors would be managers and firefighters. Managers are preemptive. They have a never again mentality. They try to protect us from situations that might trigger more hurt and pain. And then parts that take on extreme roles to get us away from danger once we're in danger. They're called firefighters. They put out the flames of the stimulation that creates problems. So managers are preemptive and firefighters are reactive. So the reactive parts of us are the ones that get us into trouble because, like firefighters, they just come in with their axes and hoses, and they can be very destructive in the service of trying to be helpful. The ones that we see mostly in our day-to-day lives are managers. Those are the ones that try to keep everything status quo, normal, even in the face of extreme difficulties. So this becomes a loop, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. But the antidote to that is to reinstall the self in a leadership position. and restore balance and harmony among our parts, and also to promote the release of the burdens that are picked up and carried by those very young, vulnerable parts of us that take on the trauma, what we call exiles, and also to deal with extreme polarizations that happen among different parts of us that have different ideas about how to protect the system. So it becomes quite a mess in there. But the IFS model is designed to tease all that out and to restore the system to its whole unburdened state. So just to kind of give you an idea of kind of a sequence that happens and how protectors become extreme. When trauma happens, it's like the Secret Service whisks the president away into hiding, and so no one knows where the president. So that sense of loss of leadership creates also a loss of trust in the self by our parts. So the exiles take on the burdens of the situation. These are painful or unacceptable feelings. The problem also is that exiles want to be rescued or redeemed, soothed, or comforted. They want to break out and be seen. But they carry pain, shame, unacceptable memories that can overwhelm the system. So parts that are preemptive, they try to act to keep the exiles hidden away, safe. When the exile is activated and surfaces, it overrides the system of managers, and then firefighters jump in and act on the escapee exiles to put them back if they escape, or try to extinguish the extreme feelings and beliefs of the exiles, or even worse, they'll even resort to self-harm and go down with the ship. They'll take the bullet for the system, knowing that the whole system will collapse if they carry this out. But suicide, other forms of self-harm, drug use, alcohol, other extreme behaviors are functions of these firefighter parts. The extreme behaviors by the firefighters stimulate other exiles in different ways. In other words, bringing in more shame, which then managers try to regain control to make things seem normal again. And then the cycle repeats itself. There might be a calm before the next storm. But this becomes a recursive loop, as we say in systems language. And if anyone's interested, by the way, in the PowerPoint, I can send it to Sheena and she can distribute it to you guys. So how the self works is the self is reinstalled in the system as a source of leadership, which often requires the aid of a trained facilitator, like a therapist or a trained counselor in a school. But people can also learn to do this naturally. Sometimes it's difficult and you do need help. But I'm going to just describe 3 major steps. The first is called unblending. In order to restore trust and confidence in the self's ability to lead, extreme protective parts need to be convinced to relinquish their roles to allow the self to take over leadership. So we have some steps that ask our parts to step back and so that they can actually experience the self and those qualities. And when they do, they tend to relax. And we may need to go through several iterations of different parts that are polarized with the self to be able to get enough separation so the parts trust the self, and then give us information about the parts that they're protecting or protecting us from, which are the exiles. So once we get permission from our protective system, we can move to working with the exiles. So once the self is allowed back into the system, the self, in connecting with and bearing witness to how the exile was wounded and to the burdens it carries, can facilitate the release of such burdens through what we call the unburdening process. We also call it the healing steps. And then finally, after the exile is able to unburden and assume a non-extreme positive set of qualities, the other extreme protector parts, that is managers and firefighters that form a constellation around this exile, can relinquish their protective roles, and thus balance and harmony in the inner system is thus restored under the self's leadership. And we call this the integration phase. So the outcome of this process is that a person is no longer reactive to situations and stimuli that they once experienced as debilitating. People often make changes in their lives, both internally and in their relationships with others, that lead to better mental health, life satisfaction, and success. Changes in the system tend to be permanent, and so people have more access to resources that help them to deal with the complexities of life. And also, studies have shown powerful results in this process in mitigating the devastating effects of even physical illnesses such as rheumatoid arthritis, migraine headaches, and many other physical type conditions. And also a lot has been advanced in PTSD in combat veterans. So there are many other studies happening. So just to tie it into the work in schools, through IFS-based therapy and other ways of gaining exposure to the principles of the model, anyone can learn to access and learn about their inner worlds and gain a new perspective on how and why they react to situations the way they do. There is a growing group of school professionals that are bringing IFS and the concept of self-leadership into the schools to increase resilience and to promote self-led relationships and communities. So examples of our colleagues would be Neil and Jane Hawks, which many of you know. Joanne Curry-Sartori, which is a former student of mine that has taken the mantle and developed an international group called the Self-Leadership Collaborative. And just like Kathy has shown, and Aaron, who's with us today, have shown leadership in bringing MFT into the schools, we're doing a parallel track and bringing IFS to the school. There are several pilot programs that are taking place in Connecticut and many other places around the US and across the globe, really, to advance the self-leadership collaborative model of school-based IFS, which actually is a non-therapy application of the model. Let's see. So we've also learned that it's important to start with the adults first. There's a teacher putting oxygen mask on their student. And we are focusing on adults because teachers are the frontline adults in the schools. When adults are calm and embody self-leadership, there's a balance and harmony in the system they're leading that facilitates cooperation, feeling valued, and openness to new learning by those being led. In other words, in their classrooms, if they are embodying those 8 C qualities, it rubs off on the students. So just to amplify that point, when someone holds what we call energy of self-leadership, they are charismatic and they draw out self-energy in others around them. So teachers can have a profound impact on their students just by creating a safe emotional space for them particularly when they're dealing with extreme emotional and behavior manifested in the moment. This allows students to rapidly self-regulate and foster a better learning environment. So I'd like to go to a case study. And this demonstrates how the IFS model can be an effective tool for an IFS-trained school-based family counselor to assist a teacher suffering from PTSD in response to the Newtown school shootings, which occurred close to where she was doing her student teaching. Through the intervention of the school-based family counselor, the teacher was able to separate from her extreme parts and reestablish self-leadership with her internal system. By doing so, she was able to be more present in her role as a teacher and significantly reduce her anxiety about being in the school setting. So I'm going to have to, I don't have a PowerPoint per se. And I'm hoping I didn't not patch the presentation. So I don't seem to. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can pull up the case study so that I can share it with you. So just bear with me for a moment. Okay, so I'm just going to tell it to you as a story. And I think it'll just take a few minutes. And then we'll close and open it up for questions. So Lisa is the teacher. She's 32. She's been a third grade teacher in a suburban elementary school for about 10 years. As a teacher education student, she was doing her student teaching placement at a school not too far from Newtown when the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School occurred. At the time, she experienced many different emotions in the aftermath of the traumatic event, including terror, fears about safety in the school she was working in, and vicarious traumatization from exposure to her classmates who were placed in Sandy Hook Elementary School at that time. Her ways of coping then were to try to push images of the events as described by both her classmates and in the media into an imaginary box in her mind, and to distract herself from feelings through emotional eating. Over time, with the help of a personal therapist, she felt that she had, quote unquote, gotten over it. Recently, after learning about another school shooting in a nearby state, Lisa began experiencing feelings of dread and panic when she entered the school building to teach her class. At that time, she didn't make a connection between the recent event and her panic attacks. So at first, she used the coping skills she learned in her counseling sessions to try to self-regulate. But as the days went on, she found it progressively harder to curb her anxiety. During her lunch break one day, she decided to seek out Kathy, the school-based family counselor in the building, to help her to calm herself down. And Kathy had been trained in the IFS model and used the method to help Lisa to identify and separate from parts of her that were overwhelmed and interfering with her being able to function effectively at her job. So Lisa, when she walked into Kathy's office, was very shaky and was having difficulty catching her breath. Kathy greeted her with a compassionate calmness that conveyed to Lisa that Kathy was willing and able to be present for her. This brought down Lisa's anxiety enough to be able to convey her experience in the moment. Kathy stated that she could see that Lisa was in distress asked her if she needed help to be able to regulate her emotions. Given Lisa's sustained state of anxiety over a period of several days, she was skeptical that it was possible and asked how Kathy could accomplish that. Kathy explained that she could help her to get to know the part of her that was taken over with such high anxiety and to learn about why it was doing that to her. By so doing, she could help Lisa to gain some distance from it, but to help it express its fears in a safe way that would not overwhelm her. Kathy explained that the natural impulse is to try to push away or hide uncomfortable or painful feelings, and this often makes the feelings worse. Lisa acknowledged that this was true for her. Kathy asked Lisa if she was willing to try something different, if it could help her with that panic part of her to stop taking over. Lisa said she would be willing to try. And notice Kathy started, instead of saying her anxiety or panic, she attributed it to a part of her that was feeling those things. So Kathy walked Lisa through the steps of the IFS model, starting with an invitation to focus her attention on the part of her that was carrying the feeling of panic. She had Lisa begin by just focusing on her breathing as a way of gaining control of her body. As she did this, her hyperventilation receded, as did her heart rate. Kathy asked Lisa to gauge her anxiety on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being extremely anxious. When it was markedly lower than the initial 10, she was able to notice that there was something inside of her, located in her belly, that was carrying her anxiety. With Kathy's help, Lisa used the guided exercise to identify the part of her that was so highly reactive and anxious about being in the school building, and to be able to feel separate from that part. As the process went on, she encountered other parts that wanted to get rid of the anxious part or hated it. And as she asked these parts to trust that she could handle hearing from the anxious part, she developed more compassion for it and did not fear it anymore. This would be the unblending that I taught. At the point that she could sit with the anxious part with compassion, it began to show her scenes of the day of her internship when she became terrified of dying in a similar scenario, including graphic images of what had been described by her peers and what she heard from the media. She asked this part to take it slowly and not to overwhelm her, and it seemed to understand that she was fully present and willing to listen. Lisa conveyed that she was open and curious and wanted to hear everything. The part that carried the traumatic memories of that day expressed relief that it was being tended to, and began to feel lighter in Lisa's body. Lisa found out that the part seemed to be stuck in the past at the time of the shootings, and Kathy guided her to retrieve the part out of that scenario and bring it into the present with her. This traumatized part was taken through steps to unload the burdens of the images and feelings of the existential terror it carried. And that's the unburdening steps, or the healing steps. And Lisa reported that it was no longer fearful and just wanted to rest. The parts of her that worked hard to prevent or stop her from feeling anxious were also updated about this release and saw that the anxious part was no longer a threat. Lisa reported that her internal experience was that these parts all wanted to hang out together. By the end of the session, Lisa stated that her anxiety level was down to a 1 or 2. Kathy checked in on Lisa 2 weeks later for a follow-up. She reported that Lisa reported that she no longer felt anxious or panicked in the building and was no longer so strongly reactive to news reports of school violence. But she still continued to feel upset about the fact that such violence still takes place on an ongoing basis. She knew that she could be proactive and trust the protocols that the school district had set up to protect the school from such attacks. She was happy that she could focus on her students and her teaching again. So I'm just going to slip back to sharing the screen. Get there. Just to finish up. Okay, so if you are interested in learning more about this model, I know I just kind of gave you the quick and dirty tour of the candy factory. The website for the IFS Institute is on the screen, ifs-institute.com. For references, listing books and other media, including demonstration videos, you can find it on the website's store. So it's the URL/store, or you can go to the website and click down on the menu IFS store, which will bring you to a wealth of information. And there are also several books and other materials on the application of IFS in schools, including a teacher's manual. I'll share a couple of my favorite ones. IFS Teacher Manual, a training handbook for using the internal family systems to improve teacher effectiveness and student success by Roger Goddard. He also has a parent manual and one from our own Neil and Jane Hawks, a book called The Inner Curriculum, How to Nourish Well-Being, Resilience, and Self-Leadership. And they have a whole chapter on IFS in that I helped them to write. So that is my presentation. And I do apologize to rush through it, but I was told I only had a half an hour to do the formal presentation. So hopefully it landed. And so I am open to any questions.
Very good. Thank you, Ralph.